Come on. I got a place for you. Should relax those eyes a bit.
Seeing sucks.
Oh, you gotta be kidding.
It sucks.
You can say that, sitting here in these prime viewing seats?
Yes.
Forget your eyes. Get your head examined.
I'm serious.
This is honestly the most ridiculous scene in the movie, but it also illustrates the frustration of having to learn a new sense. It's kind of funny, but also really strange. They're in a strip club, if you haven't seen it. And welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and today we are gonna explore sensation and perception. This episode's movie is entitled At First Sight, a rom-com, maybe? More like a romantic dramedy in my opinion. It's not that funny, so it's not really a rom-com in the sense of, 1999 sensibilities when this movie came out, but it is an interesting exploration of real life events, and we'll get into those real life events as we discuss the movie in this episode. But to give you some background here, the writers of this movie include Dr. Oliver Sacks. Now, you may be familiar with that name. Oliver Sacks was a neuropsychologist who wrote about significantly interesting neurological cases. He wrote Awakenings, the book that the movie was then based on, and the movie At First Sight, which came out in 1999, was a further exploration of another book that Oliver Sacks wrote. So we'll get into all of that stuff, but he wrote a piece of this, and I'll tell you why. Steve Levitt also wrote this script with Oliver Sacks. And the two of them put together a fictionalized version of a real-life man named Shirley Jennings. Shirley Jennings. Shirl to most. Shirl. I like saying Shirl. So Shirl Jennings was a real dude who had a very similar situation to our main character, Virgil Adamson, played by Val Kilmer. And that's why Oliver Sacks and Steve Levitt wrote this story, to explore what this might be like in a kind of love story way, right? So that's the movie that we're talking about now, inspired by a true story, not based on a true story, inspired by a true story from the mind of the man who knew the real Shirley Jennings. I think it's quite cool that Oliver Sacks was so great in the 1990s making these films. It's fun. As a psychologist, it's fun because this movie plays a really big role in when I teach sensation and perception. I use it as the movie that my students use to write a film analysis. This is like the best example of that kind of movie for this particular kind of critical thinking exercise. I love it. Irwin Winkler directed this movie. Just to round out the top crew there, Mira Sorvino plays Amy Bennick, based on Shirley Jennings' real life partner of Barbara. Kelly McGillis, about 15 years after her amazing role in Top Gun, plays Jenny Adamson, Virgil's sister, sighted sister, to be clear here. So Kelly helps Virgil live his life in upstate New York, which is a little bit more quiet, a little bit more regular for him as a blind man. Virgil as a blind man. A couple of other people that make appearances in this movie as side characters. Steven Weber plays Amy's ex-husband Duncan in a real true jerk role. Bruce Davison plays Dr. Charles Aaron, the doctor, based on the doctor the ophthalmologist who created the real life procedure that got Cheryl Jennings his life, or his, not his life back, but his vision back. So you might remember Bruce Davison as the senator in the following year in 2000 in X-Men. So a little bit more of a higher marquee role than this movie, which came out the year prior. And then a lovely bit role. He's in 2 scenes. A lovely bit role by Nathan Lane playing Dr. Phil Webster, a psychologist who helps blind children navigate their world as a blind child, right? So helping them, develop strategies to enhance their other senses while also recognizing that it is a sighted world in which they live, of course. So Virgil and Amy go and see him for help once Virgil gets his sight back. I think it's a lovely little role, and you heard a little bit in the intro cold open where they go to a strip club. And Virgil says seeing sucks. And you know what? Sometimes I'm going to agree with him. There. So let's jump into this amazing story. We'll give you more background. We'll talk about all of the sensation and the perception stuff that's in this movie. It's chock full. Like I said, I use it for my teaching. I can't wait for this episode. Let's jump in. My guest host today is Dr. KatieAnn Skogsberg. KatieAnn is an associate professor of behavioral neuroscience at Center College. Her research area is in the voluntary visual attention discipline, and she teaches courses in psychology and behavioral neuroscience. Welcome to the show, KatieAnn.
Thanks, Alex. I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking about movies with you.
Well, I am happy to have you on, and like what I like to do with my guests is to get a sense of their movie-loving value on the movie-loving scale. So I want to first briefly ask you what your thoughts on movies and films are in general, and if you use them in your teaching, how do you use them in your teaching?
Okay. So movies in general, this is a great question. I tend to be more on the brain candy side of movies. Life is complicated and challenging. And so when I watch a movie, it's usually for fun.
Okay.
And I tend to lean towards the fluff, to be honest.
That's totally fine. That's absolutely fine.
Which is funny because my husband loves horror movies. So we just watch movies separately sometimes.
I love it.
I do use them in teaching. One of the classes that I had the most fun with was a senior seminar class where the whole premise of the class was where students would choose a film that had some sort of psychological component in it.
Okay.
And then they would find the research that was associated with that, an actual research paper.
Very cool.
And they would dissect the film to figure out what was, accurate and what was inaccurate. And of course, there were some things that were really off the rails, and then there's some that were pretty accurate. So that was one of the most fun classes I ever taught, and I would love to do that again. Only we don't get to teach senior seminar very often. So
I see.
So yeah.
Okay.
And that also had
very cool.
That also made me get to watch, or helped me get to watch, a lot of movies I wouldn't have watched otherwise.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So after their reports, or while you were curating the list of movies? When did you watch them?
As they were curating the list.
Yeah. Very cool.
I generally wanted to know what to expect in their presentations. So they did presentations where they had clips of the film, and then they talked about how this represents this thing or that thing. And yeah.
I love that because while we don't hear it very often on the show for specific assignments, I do love this different approach, right? So the students curated the list. You had to watch them to know what they were expecting, but then they gave presentations and they used the clips in their presentations. I love that. I might actually borrow that for the next time I use, because I generally have film analysis papers, but this might be another way to engage students in their critical thinking, but also their presentation skills. Very good.
Okay.
Oh my God. Hi.
My turn to apologize. I should have told you I was blind.
Well, we're even. Apologies cancel each other out. Do you want to come in? I'm sorry, I just got out of the shower. I have to get changed.
Promise I won't look.
I sort of spilled some stuff on the floor. Here, why don't you sit down on the bed? And I'm just going to go change. Be right back.
All right.
You didn't have to come all the way back up here just to apologize.
Oh, it's in the neighborhood.
You were in the neighborhood?
Oh, all right, I'll confess. I was watching a hockey game with my dog, and, I don't know, I was describing you.
What?
Yeah, I was describing you to my dog and how great you smelled, and my sister thought I was describing a cake. Anyway, I just started thinking of you here in the midst of your tofu shake and really, really boring yogurt, and thought maybe you'd want to get some fresh air and take a walk around town. Just see what we see.
See what we see?
Figure of speech.
You mean right here, right now?
Great. I'm blind and you're deaf.
What a pair.
Let's jump into this film because there's a lot to talk about in this movie. So At First Sight came to our discussion here. I did something a little bit different. Normally, listeners, I ask the guests to give me some suggestions on what films that they would like to talk about. And this time I said, you know what? I really need to have a podcast episode on At First Sight because I use it every time I teach sensation and perception. Who's with me? And KatieAnn, you raised your hand. So I want to get your sense of first why you raised your hand, and then what your process was in coming to this film and all the details associated with that.
Well, I raised my hand because I saw an opportunity to hang out with the cool kids.
I appreciate that. You are one of the cool kids, though.
Oh, well, thank you. But, it seemed like a great opportunity. I had this memory of having used film in my senior seminar class, and I thought, I would like to get back to that again. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't seen the film, and it sounded like something fun and interesting. And I do, although I've never worked directly with patients, mm-hmm. I do teach a lot about visual perception and visual disorders, sure. and that kind of thing. So I thought this would be an interesting film to watch and to, I mean, it has Val Kilmer in it too. So, come on.
Yeah, it's sad we don't get to see him anymore due to his
Yeah.
throat cancer. But yeah, it's a solid 90s Val Kilmer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So I put the film title out there, and did you know that it was an Oliver Sacks story?
I did not. Of course, I looked it up on IMDb, and then I saw that it was, was by Oliver Sacks, and so I thought, okay, well, maybe this will be a little bit more accurate and more. I was more invested in it than the typical Hollywood film, because a lot of times Hollywood gets things wrong. I mean, Lucy. I'm sorry, that movie just makes me. Anyway.
Yeah, our mutual friend, for longtime listeners of the show, our mutual friend, Christina Reagan, joined me to rage watch that episode for sure. Check that episode out on how much Lucy gets wrong.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, it was knowing that it was based on one of the short stories from an anthropologist on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy Oliver Sacks. I still have a very soft spot in my heart for him and for his writing. And so I thought, well, this could be good. This could be interesting. But of course, movies always have to make it a little bit more dramatic. And yeah, it was based on, and I'm doing the air quotes here since this is audio, based on a true story.
Yeah, the trailer does the old text on the screen, inspired by a true story. Yeah, there are differences between Virgil, Val Kilmer's character, and Cheryl Jennings, the real life person. We'll get into those similarities and differences as we go through. But I wanted to ask you. You told me, KatieAnn, that you watched this recently with your sister. How did that go?
She found it, as I think I discussed with you a little bit ahead of time. We both found it entirely watchable. I wouldn't say that it was, it's not a movie that I'm going to say you should rush out and buy the DVD if anybody still does that. But it was entertaining. We enjoyed it, and it was fun to be able to talk to somebody who really doesn't know anything about visual attention and perception, but was still curious about the film. And she had some interesting insights about seeing the world, or trying to understand the world through someone else's, well, literally not eyes, not their perceptual,
absolutely,
but their other perceptual experience, and trying to see the world from someone else's perspective. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think the film does a decent job of showing the sighted world, what different things blind individuals have to do and have to deal with, and what would happen if someone got their sight back. And of course, the differences in real life and the movie sort of bleed a little bit. This starts to get fuzzy as to what is true and what was capable in the 1990s for this, and then what happens after the procedure. So I like hearing that side. Did your sister ask you whether or not this was possible in real life, if this was an actual medical experience, treatment?
No, she did not ask if that was possible. She seemed to accept it.
Okay.
And I don't know if that was just a suspension of belief because it was a film. But actually, no, she didn't. And I did struggle with it a little bit conceptually, thinking, okay, well, if he had retinitis pigmentosa, then that's a, degeneration of the retina. But then they made the argument, well, I don't know. They didn't know how much it had progressed and what did he have to lose. So yeah, it's a movie. You have to suspend some belief.
So I talked about how I use this movie in my sensation and perception class. And I've been using it now for the past 2 years. This was my third time using it fully. I had skipped a time. So I'd used it, and then I used a different movie, and then I came back to it. And it's just a really good deep well for the film analysis papers that I ask my students to complete after watching this movie. How might you jump in to use this movie in your sensation and perception, KatieAnn?
Well, this is where I want to give a shout out to Nestor Matthews, who's a professor. I believe he's at Denison.
Okay.
And he gave a talk at NITOP, and I'm blanking, National Institute of Teaching of Psychology. Is that right?
I believe that's right.
Okay. Just last year, he gave a talk on this about using sensation and perception, or teaching it from a disability standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And I've taught sensation and perception since I started teaching, back when the dinosaurs were in class. And
some smart dinosaurs.
And it opened a new window, or new perspective to me to teach a class from a disability standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was my first thought and that's another reason why I raised my hand and said, I'd love to do this, because I thought, wow, I could integrate that into this refreshed version of sensation and perception that I'm going to be using.
Yeah. And I love that perspective. That perspective.
I just this last year incorporated An Immense World, the Ed Young book about the perceptual abilities of other creatures, other animals. And that really blew my students' minds. So I thought, wow, that would be a really interesting way to integrate, different abilities. And again, coming back to this film, there was one moment in it where I can't remember whether it's Virgil or his sister, but basically said, he doesn't have a disability. This is, he's adapted to his environment. This is his world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that kind of struck me as, he doesn't need to be fixed. He's fine the way he is. And this is a little bit of a digression, but I think it adds to the conversation, at least in my context, is the town that I live in and where I teach also has one of the first and still one of the remaining schools for the deaf.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so we have a very large deaf community here. And so
awesome.
That whole argument about, deaf culture and having that their hearing is just the way they were born and the way they are, and that doesn't need to be fixed.
Right.
And so that really kind of struck me as well. And I thought, well, the perspective of Amy, the other character, the love interest in the movie, of where she's like, well, but if we could give him the chance to see, if we could fix him, wouldn't it be worth it?
Have you ever wondered what it would be like to see?
Sure. Like, whether there's life on Mars, or whether or not the aliens built the pyramids.
Okay. But if there were a chance, if something could be done to give you sight, would you take it?
What are we talking about here?
I saw that article on Dr. Aaron.
Who?
He's the leading eye surgeon on the Eastern Seaboard. And I called him up at Manhattan Eye and Ear. And I spoke to him about you.
I'm sorry, you call this guy?
Yes. And he just faxed me back. And he said that he would be very excited to see you, because he thinks that in your case there might be a chance of reversal. What do you think?
I guess I forgot that it's Help the Handicap Week.
I thought you'd be excited. What's the problem?
Is this the point, Amy? There is no goddamn problem.
Hi. Hi, Jenny. Did great work today. See you tomorrow.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. Amy, right?
Right.
Could I speak to you for a minute?
Yeah, something wrong?
Well, there's something that I don't understand. I saw that article on Dr. Aaron, and I called him, and he's willing to see Virgil. In fact, he's really anxious to see him. But when I told Virgil about him, he acted as if I was trying to...
What don't you understand?
Well, if I had spent almost my entire life blind, and there was even the remotest possibility that I could regain my sight, I would be all over that.
When there's something that you've adapted to, accepted, you go and change it without knowing the consequences? We're very happy here, Amy. Virgil has everything he needs.
Wait. Everything that he needs? Does he need to go through life blind if there's a possibility that he could see?
Look, I would give him my own eyes if it would help him see, but it won't. I learned a long time ago to stop believing in miracles.
Look, I see where you're coming from.
Yes, you do, and Virgil doesn't. Why can't you accept that? He spent the first 8 years of his life having his eyes probed, pierced, prodded, poked at by doctors, faith healers, spiritualists, shaman, medicine, and my father had him lined up outside the door. It hurt and disappointed all of us, and it almost killed him. He doesn't need to go through that again. So now maybe you understand.
But did it really fix him? You know, did it really? Yeah. So I know we're going to get to that later.
Yeah, that is definitely a existential question that is offered by the movie, and I don't think it does a very good job of being answered by the movie. And I think we can definitely pass that off to Oliver Sacks as one of the writers of the screenplay, not necessarily knowing how to best do this in a cinematic way, right? A cinematic way as opposed to his short story, which again is just a short story. It's not even a full length novel about Shirl, and then like fuzzing the lines of what is actually capable. And then at the end of the day, Val Kilmer is a sighted person. And as much as he spent time with Shirl Jennings to understand the process and what happened and just really how Shirl looked when he was blind, like where do I put my head? How do I look at people, right? Where's my gaze? I'm using air quotes, folks, because these are obviously what others observe about people, and especially blind people, and where their eyes are quote unquote looking, not actually seeing. And I just think that it was a missed opportunity to explore that question of was it really something that Virgil needed? I think the movie attempts to tie a little bow around that with the I want to say epilogue, when Virgil stays in New York City with his new seeing eye dog and attempts there are what appears to be glimmers of a rekindled romance between Amy and Virgil, but that's about it. I mean, the movie centers around a love story, so there's not much you can do, right?
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that leapt out to me too. And Val Kilmer is a very good actor, and I don't know if it was a director issue or a some sort of continuity error or whatever, but it seemed like there were. Sorry, I can't help but jump into the critical role, but there was certainly. You mentioned Val Kilmer being a sighted actor. There were certainly scenes where he was making eye contact, where he was, certainly fixating on things. And it's like knowing the disorder itself and the actual going back and reading background on Shirl and also even the short story, which is a fictionalized version of.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
That one of his problems is that he could not fixate. And so I really found myself slipping in and out of the belief on the film because of a really inconsistent portrayal of what that was like. And it seemed like he struggled to balance or find the balance. And again, it may have been a directing choice, or maybe it was a continuity error. I'm not sure, but that bothered me, because sometimes it was just Val Kilmer. Sometimes, and I mentioned this earlier in our conversations. The whole Val Kilmer, Kelly McGillis thing kept pulling me into Top Gun too.
It's so funny that they and they barely shared any scenes in Top Gun too.
Yeah,
and they were brother and sister in this movie. Yeah, definitely pulled you into 80s vibes with those two.
Yeah,
right. Absolutely. I absolutely can see where you're coming from with that one. It must have been nice for them though to see each other again after almost 15 years. To do that movie.
The cataracts are acting like a curtain across a window of sight. And if the disease to the retina is reduced or in check, which is impossible to know at this point, but if that is the case, using this new procedure, there's a very good possibility we can give you sight.
Sounds expensive.
Well, I think there's an opportunity for all of us here. Not often do we get to restore sight to someone with extended blindness. I'm sure we can get the Institute to pick up the bill here.
I've been through all this before.
Yeah, well, believe me, I know, but it's nothing as invasive as what you went through as a child. I mean, 25 years ago, cataract surgery was in the dark ages. We've come a long way since then, and Dr. Goldman here will be performing the surgery. He's one of our best.
What if it doesn't work?
Well, then you'd be no worse off than you are now. I mean, basically, what have you got to lose?
We've mentioned Cheryl Jennings a little bit, and I just kind of want to give the listeners a background on who Cheryl Jennings was, and then we'll talk about Cheryl's and then how it was recreated for Virgil's disorder, and we'll talk about their blindness in this first segment. So, as we said, Dr. Oliver Sacks wrote this movie, really big in the neuropsych and related fields. If you are in psychology and you talk about the brain, if you don't know who Oliver Sacks is, you're kind of a dweeb, right? If you don't know,
you've been living under a rock.
Absolutely, right? So he had a patient. Well, kind of technically, Cheryl Jennings was somebody else's patient, but he went in the 1990s to talk about his story to Oliver Sacks, and Oliver Sacks was a practicing physician at the time. And so they talked about him. So Cheryl's problem was that he had retinitis pigmentosa and additional disorders associated with that in his eyes. His eyes basically just didn't work properly, as one who was sighted would say, right? If we give a standard operating procedure for the eyes, his eyes were not doing that. And so by the age of 10, he could not distinguish, he could only distinguish light from dark. He knew when it was light out or when there's lights on and when it was dark. And that was it. No shadows, no contours, no information about where the light ends and begins. And in 1991, he saw an ophthalmologist to remove the cataracts that were just behind his corneas. And so we got those removed, and some of his vision returned. And he was overwhelmed by all of that information because, as you learn, and as we have found in clinical writings, whether you're a physician or a psychologist that focuses on vision or other senses, the brain is pretty plastic, especially when you're talking about a blind child. Those sensory inputs and outputs are redirected elsewhere. So his visual memory and visual perception were mostly non-existent because those connections were made in service of other senses. So he was super overwhelmed and had to go through an extensive period of visual object recognition learning so he could replace vision with smell and touch, which we see in the film. And like KatieAnn said, it was from a story in An Anthropologist on Mars. Now, unfortunately, after a bout of pneumonia, which caused some asphyxiation in his brain, led to some areas of brain death, his vision mostly degraded, and at that point, he could see some motion and some colors, not even all of the colors of the spectrum. And so that is the Cliff Notes version of Cheryl Jennings. Val Kilmer actually went and spoke with him while they were adapting this film and the screenplay. Val Kilmer spent some time, learned about his story, spent time looking at his mannerisms. By that time, Cheryl was mostly blind again. And then to end this sort of real life recap, as I said in the intro, Mira Sorvino plays Amy Bennick, and a architect who was inspired by Cheryl's real life partner, Barbara, and their sort of on and off again relationship that ended on again until Cheryl's death in 2003. So that's the Cliff Notes version. And so, KatieAnn, I wanted to get your breakdown, as you've mentioned, teaching from a disabilities perspective. We're going to talk about blindness. And so what is retinitis pigmentosa? What are cataracts? What is the situation in the film associated with Virgil's blindness?
Well, so one of the things that I found really interesting about this and might not be obvious to someone who doesn't work in vision or isn't as familiar with it is that he really was dealing with two different visual distortions or problems.
Yeah.
One being the retinitis pigmentosa. And what that is it's a degeneration of the retina. So one of the things that's really cool that your listeners might not know is that the retina is actually brain tissue. And I just love that. That's And it's when your brain is developing, there's little buds that actually kind of come off of the brain itself, and they migrate forward and they form the retina itself.
That's awesome.
So they're kind of an exposed piece of brain tissue. But they so I'm geeking out on that. I'm sorry.
I love it. Keep going.
But so retinitis pigmentosa is this degeneration where a lot of times it'll start in the macula, and at least that's my understanding with this particular with Virgil's character or Cheryl's actual situation. And the macula is the area around the fovea where you have your high resolution vision. I mean, that's where you focus things that you really want to look at.
Yep.
And so that was one issue. And this disorder, causes the slow degeneration or breakdown of those that part of the eye. And that's really, if you want to think of the eye as something that converts light into brain signals, that's what the retina does. It's kind of like I know a lot of people use different analogies, but I'm going to say it's a little bit like the keyboard on your computer. When light hits the retina, then it turns that light signal into a neural impulse. So if you were typing on your computer keyboard, it turns those little button taps into letters or something like that.
I like
so
that. So
that's analogy. The way I would. Yeah.
I like that analogy.
That's the way I would describe it. So basically, over time, his keyboard, more and more of the keys were no longer working. For example, I have a little computer that I take with me, and the 5 and the 6 on the keyboard don't work because I spilled tea on it once. Now, if that were to progressively spread across the keyboard, then that would, be like retinitis pigmentosa. So that was one issue that he was dealing with. The other issue, of course, is the cataracts. And the cataracts, that's maybe a term that more of us are familiar with.
Sure, yeah. It happens more. It's more common in elderly populations. Yeah.
Yeah. And cataracts are when you get basically clumps of protein or detritus or just basically impurities in the lens of the eye. So on the outside of your eye, you have the cornea. That's the clear part. And then you have the iris. That's the colored part of the eye.
Mm-hmm.
And then the lens sits behind the iris, and it does some focusing, some minor adjustments. It's like the fine focus on your binoculars or your camera,
Yeah.
that does the last tweaking to fixate something in the fovea at the back of your eye.
Mm-hmm.
And with cataracts, you get this cloudiness in that. You get these distortions, and it reduces the amount of light that can get into the eye.
Mm-hmm.
And it also then impairs the lens's ability to focus that image.
Yeah.
So getting back to the movie, sorry, I geeked out on all that. But that's what I find really interesting and fun. In the film, and in reality, he had two disorders, two conditions that he was dealing with.
Right.
And the original idea was the thought, and I think that cataract surgery, I don't know, it wasn't new. Cataract surgery has actually been around for a long time.
Right.
In really frightening formats. But anyway, more recently, it's gotten very, very good. My parents both had cataract surgery, and it was painless and effective. But they can basically replace that lens with either cadaver lens or something.
Isn't it wild?
Yes,
That's wild.
They can
because
replace
the lens, for those of you who don't know, the lens is made of the same protein, keratin, as your fingernails. And so they grab what happens to keratin as it dries out is it gets more solid and less translucent. So you don't want like too dry a keratin, right? If you're going to get a cadaver lens, it has to be in that aqueous solution that your eye is in to remain translucent for that focusing of light. So wild.
Yeah. I don't know. You might need to edit this part out, but it's best to have a really fresh cadaver lens, right?
You know what?
Anyway,
you make a lot of sense. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So so they can replace that, and but they can't fix or replace the retina itself.
Mm-mm.
And so I think the premise of the film was that they were going to replace his lenses because cataract surgery, was possible.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought maybe it was just the cloudiness that was disrupting his ability to see, and that maybe his retina would still be functional, and they couldn't inspect the retina because of the cloudiness of the cataracts. And they were hoping that his retina still had some function, and or his keyboard, so to speak, still had some function.
So just to add into the discussion here, so he's getting the cataract surgery, and they're thinking that his retinitis pigmentosa wasn't advanced along enough. So this and it was billed as this like new experimental surgery. And one of the questions that's raised in the movie is like, how are we going to pay for this? Like, Virgil's just a massage therapist in upstate New York at a at a getaway club, and they're like, oh yeah, no, this is experimental. I'm sure the organization / institution will pay for it. And I was just like, this is 1990s math right now.
Yeah.
In 1990s healthcare, imagine being and the interesting thing is that there is a really cool parallel to real life in a situation where a patient would definitely not have the funds to go through a experimental, fresh, new, not a lot of data kind of treatment, And I don't know if you're familiar with this case, KatieAnn, but there is a new treatment for sickle cell so if you're not familiar with this is a blood disorder where the red blood cells are sickle shaped, so they look like sickles, which means they can't transport oxygen because their hemoglobin is misshapen. So it leads to a lot of issues. And CRISPR, the gene editing technology, has been used to modify the bone marrow cells, which create...
This is what I didn't know about.
Which creates red blood cells. And so CRISPR then, the gene editing, was used in this woman somewhere in the South, maybe Louisiana. I'm not sure. NPR's been tracking this woman for a long time. She could definitely not... she was bedridden. She had several kids, couldn't do anything with those kids, and volunteered for this treatment. And she is up and at 'em, and she's basically got a new lease on life. Amazing thing. And of course, one of the open questions is this permanent? Is like her bone marrow going to produce correctly shapen blood cells for the rest of her life? Is she going to need continuous treatment? What is the prognosis for her? She's like, you know what? I don't really care about all of that right now. I'm just so happy that I can live life not from a bed, basically. And I think that's very interesting because we see the progression of Virgil throughout the movie, going through the surgery, being overwhelmed, like Cheryl said he was, with all of the new visual information. Apparently, he could see enough to where he didn't have to walk around with his cane. He didn't have to wear sunglasses or anything like that, like a blind person generally does in public. And then we see a bad news bears come up in the movie where the doctor says, or Virgil first experiences bouts of visual, we'll call it whirlwinds, maybe, periods of where he's just like, he gets too much information and it makes him woozy, dizzy, disoriented, that kind of thing. So what he is attempting to do is then hide that from Amy, and his doctor's like, you know what? Can't do anything about it. Your retina's bad, I guess. They don't go into too much detail about why he starts to lose his vision again. It's just, it just happens.
Well, I think they say something about it. I can't remember if they say something about it being not strong enough or that it just, I can't remember. Yeah. But the implication was that it just couldn't handle all the new information or something like that.
Yeah, which is strange.
Jenny's cool. She's really great with these kids. You see that guy across the street? Over in the doorway. He's chain smoking, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, that's my friend Bruce. We watch the game together sometimes. Oh, here comes Nancy. She's the librarian, gets me any book I want in Braille. Hey, Nancy.
Hey, Virgil, I got that book in for you.
Still haven't got that old jalopy fixed.
No, if I got it fixed, how would you know it was me? Hi.
Nancy,
Hi.
This is Amy. Amy,
Hi,
this is
Amy.
Nancy.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Gotta
Have
go.
fun.
Be careful, honey. He's all hands.
Be nice.
Yeah.
Nice town you have here. Seems to be very popular with the ladies.
Oh, yeah. Moved here when I was 8. I figured it was a good place for me to grow up in. It's a bit geriatric, but it works.
Do you mind me asking how long you've been blind?
No, not at all. Started when I was 1 and completely gone by the time I was 3. Congenital cataracts with a healthy dose of retinitis pigmentosa thrown in for good measure.
So you see no bright lights? Nothing?
Nope. Blind as a bat. Actually blinder. bats emit sonar. Wish I had that sonar. I don't have a sixth sense. I don't have a fifth one. Never wrote a book like Helen Keller. Wish I could play the piano like Ray Charles. I really wish I could sing like Stevie Wonder. But I can't.
Got it.
So before we get into the break, KatieAnn, I wanted to talk about the portrayal of blindness in the movie, with the caveat that we are both sighted individuals and we cannot speak for the blind. We're just coming at this from a learned perspective, talking about blindness in our sensation and perception courses. So what was your sense of the blindness portrayal in the movie?
Well, I kind of go back to what I said earlier about how it was inconsistent. They did want to show that he was capable and functional in his environment. That there's the ice skating scenes. And to me, that opened a lot of questions. I wanted to know how he had learned how to skate and what his experience was like that. As someone who has ice skated on a pond, that is a really wild sensory experience. It's not smooth ice. It's rattly and bumpy. And I think that would be extremely challenging for someone who it's challenging for someone who is sighted. But then again, maybe his experience and his ability to use touch and kinesthetics, sensory knowledge of where your body is and auditory processing helped him with that.
Yeah.
But I think there was strengths and weaknesses. The fact that he was a massage therapist, which I think that was accurate, right? The actual character was a massage therapist, or the actual person. I found that really interesting because it did kind of capitalize on his strengths.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know if I've answered your question. I feel like because I don't know if I can really talk about the portrayal of blindness without having extensive firsthand knowledge of someone who really is totally blind. I have had a former student who literally did have retinitis pigmentosa. And I know the student is fine with, I've asked them for their permission to talk about their experiences because they would even come and talk to my class while they were still here. But the interesting thing is their retinitis pigmentosa progressed from the peripheral to the central.
Yeah.
And all they had left was the macula and their fovea.
Yeah.
And they talked a lot about how they saw the world basically through a window.
Yeah, I've heard that
at
a lot
distance.
before. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this then. From your interaction with that student and how they navigated their space, similarities, differences in how it was presented in the movie.
I think that Val did a good job of emulating some of the behaviors and necessary behaviors for this. The student did as well. The student used a cane to navigate their environment because they didn't have peripheral vision. So they needed to know the width of things and distance, and it helped them with depth perception. And also the scanning movements of, moving his head around as Val Kilmer's character did. And I think those of us that are sighted tend to be very self-conscious about our physical behaviors and mannerisms. And both Kilmer's character and then also my former student, had some gestures and expressions and movements that, maybe are not, that are unique to them. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it.
And that do tend to characterize individuals who may be blind. I don't want to stereotype anyone, but the looking off into the distance, if you can call it that, because you don't even know that they're looking.
Right. Yeah.
But those kinds of things.
We spend so much time looking at the gaze of others because of the evolutionary advantage of knowing what other people are looking at, knowing what other animals are looking at, right? Whether or not an animal or predator is looking at us and with drooling lips, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Right? So we spend a lot of time looking at people's gazes. And I remember when I was young, focusing on, I still have problems with social, not on a spectrum level, but like just like social pleasantries, these kinds of things is still still are mystifying to me. But one of the things that I kind of didn't listen to people saying was don't stare, and I would just, and it wasn't from a place of malice. I was just really very curious at the blind people that I would encounter in my life, and I would spend a lot of time looking at them. And of course, there's the don't stare, but at the same time, I know that they don't know that I'm looking at them. And so that's another thing, right? People stare at blind people because we know that they're not looking at us, and so we tend, I won't say we.
So we're violating a social norm because we think they don't know.
Absolutely, because we think they don't know. And I'll just speak for myself here as a curious person. I learned a lot about how blind people navigate their worlds, and becoming very observant about how a cane is used, the reasons for wearing sunglasses in all circumstances, because for some blind people, light itself is too much. And then how they move their heads around. I thought Val Kilmer did a decent job of doing that. But like you said earlier, he does make, even before he gains his sight in the movie back, he does make a lot of eye movements that seem like he's just looking at various points. And I wonder if, like you said, if it was a direction like, hey, Val, look at this point in the tree while you're, skating with Mira over here or whatever. So it'll give you a point to just like focus on as you're moving around the pond or whatever. So I thought that was really interesting. The other thing that I thought that I'll add here before we take a break is Kelly McGillis's character, his sister, and how protective of his life that she is. She's like, he lives here in upstate New York. He's got a simple life. He knows where everything is. He knows who everyone is. And he doesn't have to navigate a world for sighted people in the same way that he would if he goes to New York with you homewrecker. You homewrecker, you, Amy.
Yeah.
How dare you? Like, she's very and then of course I think well justified anger when Amy comes up with this plan, talking with the doctor and trying to, not necessarily convince, but maybe do some subtle persuasion of Virgil and getting this. And a very interesting character. We don't have time to get into Amy as a kind of a monster character, but I would listen to that argument. But we have more show to discuss because we have what Sensation and Perception is all about, and that is talking about all the psychological ways that someone knows what they're looking at, right? So stay tuned for more At First Sight discussion after this break. Are you a big fan of the Cinema Psych podcast? A connoisseur of the compelling stories and intriguing insights that we have on this show? Well, show your love in style with our premium podcast merchandise. Yeah, that's right. I've updated the podcast store from ultra comfy hoodies, perfect for cozy podcast binges, to sleek coffee mugs that add a dash of personality to your morning routine, our merchandise store has it all. I've added so many new products, and it's designed to withstand countless listening marathons. There are a lot of episodes. I think you'll love them. But wait, there is more. Every week, there is a new promotion, turning up the volume on value. So keep an eye out for our exciting special promotions. Every other week, 15% off. In between, sometimes there's a special 25% off day. And then sometimes there's free shipping. It's the perfect way to score your Cinema Psych podcast merch for less. I'm excited to have expanded the merchandise offerings, but I'm really excited to say that new designs are coming up. And you can put these designs on all of the merchandise. So keep an eye out for new arrivals in the design section. So don't just listen, wear it, flaunt it, live it. Visit our merchandise store at cinemapsychpod.swanpsych.com/store to shop your love for the Cinema Psych podcast today. Remember, every purchase goes directly to supporting this show. And of course, thanks for listening to this show. I love doing it. Now let's get back into it. And we are back with Dr. KatieAnn Skogsberg talking At First Sight, the 1999 movie based on Oliver Sacks's patient, Shirl Jennings. And in this segment, what we are going to do is talk about the visual perception that sort of encapsulates the middle portion of the movie. The beginning portion is the blooming, I guess we'll call this the first act, the blooming romance between Amy and Virgil, and his blindness as a central feature of their relationship. But the correction of that blindness leads us into the second act, which is chock full of visual perception, learning, and concept nuggets. Oh, the morsels here are plentiful. Now, this is the part of the movie where my students focus almost entirely on when they write their film analyses, and because the morsels are there. So the first and largest set of morsels is the broad concept of object recognition. So KatieAnn, can you describe just broadly what object recognition is in visual perception?
Sure. So again, if you kind of think about assembling things, maybe like words on your, as you're writing them on a page, as visual information comes into your eye, the retina turns it into neural signals. You can almost think of that as like a code, a little tapping rate at how fast the neurons are firing. And your brain then has to decode. It's kind of like Morse code, right?
Mm-hmm.
It has to decode it into something meaningful, something that is generally attached to a memory and often has a name and a function associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that information is kind of crazy that visual information goes from the front of your head all the way to the very back of your head
Mm-hmm.
in the occipital lobe, where it gets decoded. And the first step in that process is basically figuring out the edges of things,
Mm-hmm.
finding the edges of objects. So there's lines and curves and, contrast and color. And all of that stuff is decoded at the back of the brain, but it's also decoded separately. We call it parallel processing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a cluster of neurons or a little portion of the brain that does, edges at a certain angle, and another portion of the brain that does color and, all these bits of information. And it's still not decoded yet. It's just kind of these representations. And then that information gets fed forward or passed forward into the brain. And I mean, literally forward. It goes from the back of the brain and starts moving towards there's a region of the brain called the temporal lobe, or the inferior temporal lobe region. So it's kind of the lower area of the temporal lobe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually the part that's kind of behind your ears.
Mm-hmm.
And that region of the brain helps make connections between your memories of, that particular angle or color or whatever combination, and the name of that object, and maybe memories of. I'm going to be careful here because there's another part of the brain that really does, we call it the how region or the where region, in the parietal lobe. So it's kind of crazy again, because it gets separated.
Mm-hmm.
Those colors and edges and shapes, all get sent to two different regions. I'm gesturing here, which I realize does not work in podcasts. But, there's another part of the brain that is the parietal region that's kind of above your ear. I'll put it that way, above and behind your ear. And that one tells you where something is. And sometimes it also is called the how region, or what you do with that object.
Right.
And then eventually it all comes together to where it actually has some sort of meaning or some sort of representation, something that's meaningful to you. Most people who are interested in psychology have heard of the hippocampus, the memory region of the brain. It has a role in kind of connecting all of this information, but really it's that inferior temporal region, and it literally, this is so confusing, but we call it the what region of the brain, and that tells you what an object is. Brain then takes all of that information, all of those little bits of information, say it's something that is red, that has lots of edges, and some round things towards the bottom, and maybe some long lines on it. And you think, okay, red, long lines, round things on the bottom, moving quickly. Oh, that might be a fire truck. Okay.
I was wondering where you were going with that. Yes.
Oh, does it? So you kind of assemble all the bits and pieces to recognize things, and sometimes this goes wrong.
Yeah,
that's always the fun thing. That's what we love teaching in S&P, is when you can have this. What creates visual illusions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is the fact that these bits and the pieces of information come in and they're ambiguous, and our brain will assemble them in several different ways. And sometimes that ends up being confusing.
Yeah. So. And we see things that aren't there.
Right. Okay. Virgil, it says here you went blind as a child before you developed a visual vocabulary. You have a problem with depth of field, space, shape, size, and distance. It's fascinating. There's only been 20 cases of this in the last 200 years. Basically, your eyes work, but your brain hasn't learned to process the information. You are mentally blind. Neurologists call this visual agnosia.
Well, I call it pretty screwed up.
That's a much better term. I'll bring it up at the next meeting. Although, it would be difficult to get grant money for the Pretty Screwed Up Foundation. I have something I'd like to read to you. Oh, Rugula? I made it myself. Damn it. My glasses, I can never find them. Mrs. Fenster, help! Thank you. Happens all the time. Okay, Alberto Valvo. Sight restoration after long-term blindness. One must die as a blind person to be born again as a sighted person. However, it is the interim, the limbo between two worlds, that is so terrible. There you go, pal. You're in limbo.
Right, that's it? Limbo? I mean, that book doesn't have anything else that might help us with Virgil's condition?
Limbo's not that bad. It's like New Jersey. You can see where all the good stuff is happening. You just have to get there. I know. You were expecting Anne Bancroft. A dramatic breakthrough out by the water pump. I'm sorry, I'm just a professor. I teach people how to teach the blind, how to become independent. Unfortunately, there's no manual on what you're going through. I'd like to help, but like the rest of things in life, it's really up to you.
Are you crazy? I'm completely confused. You said You'd like to help. So we came here for help.
All right, all right. You want a lesson?
Yes.
All right. Here we go. Lesson number 1. Repeat after me. The rain in Spain stays look, I'm kidding. It's a joke. What's this?
It's an apple. An apple.
Good, good. You've now won the toaster oven. Okay. What's this?
It's an apple.
Good, but is it an apple or just a picture of an apple?
Okay. So, this is a joke, right? What are you saying, that my eyes lie?
Well, your eyesight can and will play tricks on you. No matter what I could teach you, no matter what exercises I could give you, they'll still play tricks on you. You've got to learn to trust your instincts.
I don't have any instincts. My instinct is to close my eyes and feel my way out of your office.
Well, there you go. That's a self-preservation instinct. But you have others. Look, Virgil, you have to learn to see just like you learn to speak. Perception, sight, life is about experience, about reaching out and exploring the world for yourself. It's not enough to just see. We've got to look as well.
In the movie, before Virgil regains his vision, how does he recognize objects?
Yeah, so he tends to recognize objects by touch, and or by auditory, kind of auditory identification. Like there's a scene where they're walking down the street and he's describing everything to her, and he's saying that there's a lady that's coming out and describing exactly what she's going to do, and all these things. And that there's a tree over here and a car, or I don't remember you can probably play a sound clip here.
And the standing in the rain, just listening to the rain.
Yes.
It's a very, I would say the listening to the rain is a blind trope. So it gets, and what I mean by that is it gets overused with blind characters, because you will see that in the Daredevil Marvel stuff, where his superpower is being blind, but all of his other senses are like tuned to the max. He can know who a person is just by listening to their heartbeat or whatever. And so, they do that whole trope. But a lot of it is based in touch. He knows what things are when he can touch them. And I think obviously that makes a lot of sense, right? Get it? It makes a lot of sense.
Oh, but okay.
But
very punny.
Thank you. But let's fast forward to now he is sighted, but he is struggling. He does not know what he's looking at. So they go and see a doctor who runs a school for blind children, helping them navigate a sighted world, right? And so he's got this doctor is a sighted person. He's played by Nathan Lane. Great character. I'm glad Nathan Lane got his time in this movie. Too short, if you ask me. Yeah, but great nevertheless. And he explains to the audience, without using any fancy words, visual agnosia. How does he describe this for the audience, KatieAnn?
Well, he describes it as the fact that Virgil can't connect the information from his incoming senses with what he knows about the object or what that object or his memory of that object.
Yeah.
And so he helps him relearn that information by having him look at something and then touch it and recognize it, and then go back and forth and learn the visual representations and associating. He basically talks about association agnosia, which is can't make the connection between the sensory information and what that object is used for, what it is.
And so he uses an apple, and he shows
Oh, yeah.
the apple to Virgil, and he's like, "What's this?" And Virgil doesn't know what it is. And he hands him the apple, and Virgil goes, "Oh, it's an apple." And he kind of feels defeated at that moment because he's like, "Oh, well, I should know what an apple is. I should know what an apple looks like." And the key word there is should. Because society, like, it's an apple, bro. It's one of the most common fruit representations out there. Like, you should know what an apple is just by looking at it. But of course, he doesn't have those connections in his memory, as you say. And this is what you see in like stroke survivors who then have visual agnosia afterward.
Yeah.
They can't name an object, but once you put it in their hands, they're like, "Oh, these are keys," right?
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing that happens immediately after Virgil is holding this apple is there's a picture of an apple in a magazine that Dr. Webster pulls out, and he's like, "Okay, what's this then?" Well, because it's a picture of an apple, Virgil can't get the touch information from that, which I think is a critical thing about sight that we don't spend enough time talking about. That there are physical things in the world that our brains are evolutionarily attuned to, right? Because we navigate a 3D environment. But then we can also represent those with 2D images. And because we spend a lot of time doing that, we learn that. Virgil doesn't have that.
Yeah, I think that's really, we often think about how 3-dimensional space is harder to represent than, 2-dimensional images. But in reading the Anthropologist on Mars segment, they talk about how the blind individuals, their whole world is 3-dimensional. Everything is represented 3-dimensional. And as soon as you give them something 2-dimensional, it's like, what? They doesn't have a representation.
This is a sheet of paper. This is a sheet of paper.
Yeah, and you can't get any information from that. It reminds me, and again, this might be a bit of a tangent, but I saw a thing on, I think it was CBS Sunday Morning the other day. It was an artist who was recreating, and maybe I'm getting the show wrong, but they're recreating famous artwork for the blind, and they're making it all tactile. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, which leads us to the montage, so to speak, of the movie where Virgil and Amy are living in New York City in Amy's apartment, and she's going to work like normal, doing her architect thing, and Virgil now has to learn how to be a sighted person, which is an interesting thing to say for an adult, right? Adults don't generally have to do this in regaining a sense, more like losing a sense, and they have to learn how to navigate with less information, not more information. So I really like this. Amy's neighbor, a younger boy, comes and helps Virgil in like stuff that you would do with a toddler, right? Show them the object. Can you name it? Oh, do you have to touch it? Okay, well, that's kind of like, if you were doing like a point-based system, you get 3 points for naming the object just by sight, -1 point if you have to hold it, that kind of thing, And then you do this great montage of Virgil just learning basic household items.
Yeah, I think that's, and I think that probably is a more accurate representation of the whole process, and probably something a lot of us don't think about, wouldn't
I think
experience.
We take it for granted, for sure.
One of the things that can I jump into a criticism here for a second?
Sure.
So one of the things that really frustrated me, and it's probably something your students bring up, is the idea, and I think this would be really hard for a non-expert audience to understand, but when they first take the bandages off, the images, the way that they represent the Virgil's sight is just a blurry camera shot, that it's just blurry. And then eventually it comes into focus. And with knowing how visual agnosia works and knowing how the visual system works, I wish they would have represented that with like a kaleidoscope. That would have been so much more accurate of what his experience is. Because there's no way for Virgil to know what a face looks like. There's no way, he's never had that, the spatial representation, that information coming in through his eyes before. Now he's done it with his hands.
Yeah.
But not with his eyes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because even if he was sighted as a child, because we learned this backstory of his dad running out on the family because he didn't want to raise a blind boy. And so maybe Virgil, as a baby, got all of this visual information about what faces look like and things like that. But then, we also know that the brain gets rid of all of this information as you grow, because it's not needed. And then so if blindness occurs after that, then he may not have those connections. I'm willing to give the writers, Oliver Sacks, and the description from Sherrill the benefit of the doubt here, and say that Sherrill probably did have an idea of what faces looked like. I don't think we could say that as a fully from congenital blind person would have that representation. That would be kaleidoscope, definitely. But I agree with your overall point that they're representing his vision, more or less his eyes, as a camera. And we know that the eye is absolutely not a camera, and I would hazard to say that it's actually better than a camera. Our fovea has a far more resolution than even some of the more powerful cameras that exist. And then we have our brain, which is so adaptable to visual information that a camera sensor might not be. So I would agree with you that the premise of visual play in the movie kind of lacks some imagination. Oh, let's just make it like a camera. It goes from blurry to focused.
Yeah.
It's like,
no.
I don't think that is, because I can hold a Coke can in my hand and still make it look blurry by just changing where my eyes are focused, right? So just because he's holding it doesn't mean that the can now is all focused. So I will grant you that one. Lack of imagination on the filmmaker's part. But at the same time, I will say, let's be honest, this was a run-of-the-mill 90s dramedy love story, right? Romantic dramedy. So they didn't really, there wasn't a lot of avant-garde or creativity when it came to the more psychological and perceptual aspects. That to say that I think they did a pretty good job of somebody who has to go through agnosia training.
Sure. Yes.
That was pretty good. That was pretty good.
Extreme disorientation. The images and colors had no meaning for him. But now, just weeks after surgery, Mr. Adamson has mastered the ability to define shape and distance, giving him confidence to move about his environment. However, he still becomes confused by new images, just as a child would be fascinated by everyday objects that we may take for granted.
Look up.
What is it?
It's art. Du Buffet.
This is art?
Oh, no, that has to be art. Look at that. That is beautiful.
No, that's just somebody being destructive. The words read something pretty nasty, Virgil.
What is it?
It says pig shit.
And though his progress is steady, Virgil is still very reliant on his touch to interpret objects in his surroundings.
It's a dog.
I'm sorry, yes.
And his understanding of three-dimensionality is very limited and confounding to him.
Oh, wow. Listen to the bells.
What's that? That lump?
Oh, that's a homeless person.
You just walked right past him. You didn't even look.
Well, I mean, some things you choose not to see. I mean, you can't look at everything, Virgil.
I don't want to look away. I want to see. I want to see everything.
What the hell are you looking at? Get out of here.
He also has great difficulty with scanning. Basically, that's putting the whole picture together.
I've got over 10 years experience at Bear Mountain in all kinds, really. Deep tissue, therapeutic, shiatsu.
That's fine. Let's get you started. Here's your I-9, W-4, workman's comp, basic employment package. Just fill these out, take them over to accounting at the back of the gym.
Oh, gosh, you know what? I forgot my glasses. I'm just gonna take this home and fill it out, and I'll just bring it back, okay?
All right.
This includes his ability to read, meaning he has a total lack of visual memory.
Sweetie, it might help if you kind of take the word.
No, it won't. It won't help, Amy. I told you before, it's not helping. I know what I'm supposed to do. I just can't do it, okay? I can't read. By the time I get to the last layer, I can't remember the first one. I can't fill out a goddamn application. I have to have somebody else do it for me like I was a blind person, but I'm not blind. Your helping isn't helping.
Okay, I'm sorry.
This is an unexpected physiological flaw and one that we hope that Virgil will be able to overcome.
So let's move into a more specific form of agnosia, prosopagnosia. This is a fancy word for lack of facial recognition. So imagine your brain as your iPhone recognizing your face and Face ID, that your brain can do that kind of thing with other people's faces, including your own. But people with prosopagnosia have this difficulty. So KatieAnn, how was prosopagnosia portrayed in the film?
Well, one of the interesting things, the first time that Virgil is looking at Amy and he wants to, there's one scene where he wants to inspect her face, after he's, I think he even says, so this is the face. This is what a face looks like or something like that.
Yeah.
And and again, I'm gesturing here. I'm using my fingers to explore an imaginary face. And so in this case, he just simply doesn't even know what a face looks like, at least according to the way that he represents it there. Of course, he knows what a face feels like. He has a mental representation of touch of a face. And so he's having to learn to make that association between the relationship of that. What's interesting, though, is his inability to recognize facial expressions. Constantly through the movie, he's asking, "What's this space? What's this space?" And not so much as "Who are you?" but "What does that mean?" He even says, "I haven't seen this space before," and that. He's trying, he doesn't understand, doesn't pick up on visual cues about, emotional. And we take so much of that for granted that we understand what the other person is thinking or saying based on their facial expression. So he has to learn all of that information new. I mean, we all know how frustrating it is to understand what someone else is saying when you're talking on a phone without FaceTime, when you actually are listening on the phone. And yet that's been Virgil's entire world. And now he has to learn to associate visual information with that emotional context. And
I think that's a great way to put it, because we all struggle with micro expressions, and micro expressions are so subtle. And dude was just trying to get by with broad facial expressions like happy and sad. And of course, he could contort his face. He will definitely express his emotions on his face, just like everyone else does. A blind person does that regardless. But trying to interpret that from other people is really interesting, because he, as a blind person, at least as portrayed in the movie, I'm not saying this about all blind people, have to extract so much more information from the nonverbals in the auditory signal, right? So sighted people get nonverbals not only in the auditory signal, but in facial expressions. and gaze and everything like that. Why are you looking away? These kinds of things. But he had to extract every bit of information from that auditory signal that he could. So Amy could be lying in her voice, and can he extract that lying from her? But now he has the face to look at, and he's like, well, wait, I've heard your inflection.
Mm-hmm.
Does this match this new face? Is my representation of your auditory signal matching the face that you're putting on?
Yeah. Well, and something else that I kept thinking about while I was watching it is, competition for resources. So he's allocated so much of his brain area to decoding auditory and tactile signals. Now we have this new input of visual information. So where is that information going? And is it having, the brain is a little bit like a battery in the fact that you can only pull so many resources to any one area. So where is that information going? Where is it? And is it drawing down on the resources that he could be using for decoding the auditory information? And you and I experienced that. There's a meme on social media about, having to turn the radio down so that you can read the street signs, but that's true.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is true because you have to allocate your resources. And so I'm wondering how much of his auditory input was being disrupted or lost due to the fact that he was now having to decode the visual information.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because it's not as if your brain goes, I'm ready to do something different with what I currently use from the rest of the body. They show Virgil he does get tired and he does get fatigued more easily, and I think that was a great job from the filmmaker's perspective to have Virgil get fatigued from doing all of this, and more fatigued than someone who would just be like, I'm sick of learning today.
Yeah.
Right.
No.
But you make an excellent point that like something's got to give.
Yeah. Well,
something is likely to give.
It's not like our visual area is just sitting there waiting to be used, especially if in his case that the occipital cortex has probably been recruited and remapped to do auditory and tactile decoding and representation.
At least in the imagery department too, because research does also suggest that these areas underutilized by a blind person get projections from those other areas for imagery's sake.
Yeah.
Oh, I can only imagine somebody who is blind but also has aphantasia.
Ooh.
That is quite the combination. So aphantasia, for the folks that don't know, is the inability to create mental images, or the mental images aren't as vivid as neurotypical individuals. And so you add that to blindness. How does that work? That's wild. So another aspect of visual perception that occurs in the movie is depth perception. So Virgil almost gets run over by a taxi because he is just trying to figure out depth perception. There's this one interesting, quick visual gag where he's looking at a taxi in the movie, and the way that the camera is set up is that he looks like he's like reaching for a taxi that's on the road, but then they switch the angle on us and it shows that he's playing with a model taxi. So I thought that was good. But KatieAnn, describe what depth perception is to the listeners.
So this is one of those things that even students in my S&P class often struggle with, sensation and perception class. It's one of the harder things to explain because you have to think about the fact that we have two eyes set on the front of our head, and we tend to focus on something, an object in the distance. And if you think of drawing lines that connect the center of connect your pupil to whatever it is that you're focusing on, and then a line that connects those two pupils, you could create a triangle. Okay. Does that work? And
yep, that works.
And we literally use triangulation to figure out how far something is. So how much our eyes have to turn in to focus on it. So if you take your finger, and again, I'm gesturing in this podcast, but if you bring your finger closer to you, your eyes have to turn inward to stay focused on it. And that is one of the signals that tells us how close or how far away an object is. The
right, yeah.
One of the other signals is occlusion, which is once something covers another thing up. So I think the classic example is if you're riding in a car and you see fence posts moving and they're covering up the cow in the background, you know that the fence post is between you and the cow or you and the tree. So that's what we call occlusion. It's occluding or hiding the other thing. So that gives us a little information about maybe an ordinal or a sequential location of objects. And then the third cue that we use is this binocular disparity. And this is the one that's really hard for people to kind of grasp.
Yeah.
The image in the distance is projected to our brain, projected to our occipital lobe. And because our eyes are at two different locations, each eye gets a slightly different view of the world. And so that's where the word disparity comes from. They're not the same visual angle. They're not the same distance visual. These are jargony words. They aren't the same picture. They don't, if you were to overlap them on top of each other, they wouldn't quite perfectly mesh. And if you've ever looked at what's called a stereogram, these are those old-fashioned, they look like a viewfinder. Actually, the Viewmaster, the good old-fashioned Viewmaster that gives you a 3D image of things.
Absolutely.
Is literally a binocular disparity image creator.
Right.
But what it does is it sends these two different images to each eye, and our brain then tries to overlap those. And depending on how difficult it is to overlap those two images and how hard it is to line them up, it gives us an estimate of how far away something is. How's that for an explanation?
That was great.
It's really hard to do without visuals.
Yeah, it really is. It's funnily enough, without visuals. Yeah, that was that was great. One of the things that I talk about with binocular disparity is, of course, 3D movies and stereograms like the Viewmaster. Superb way to describe binocular disparity because our eyes are not in the same position. Now, Virgil didn't use his eyes, didn't converge them, as you said, didn't care about occlusions. If it wasn't in his immediate arm span vicinity or the span of his cane, then it was just an auditory or a smell, and it didn't really have a necessary distance comparatively with something else, right? So we don't get depth perception per se from the auditory system. We only get distance as far as we only get distance information as far as how far away is it from me, but not comparatively speaking, unless you had two sounds.
Yeah.
And so Virgil didn't have to do any of this computation, brain computation. But when he regained his sight, and he was using his sight as his primary sense at that point, he did have to use, he did have to get depth perception in line. And I would say that while it is innate, according to Eleanor Gibson and her research with the visual cliff, while depth perception is an innate function, not learned, I think you still need to recognize that monocular depth perception, that is with one eye, this idea of occlusion is learned. And we have to get as much visual information as we can to do that learning, to find that the moon in a basket photograph is just a play on perspective. And that you have the knowledge that those things are really far. One is really close and the other one's really far away, and they just happen to be at the right distance to make the moon in the basket kind of
Yeah,
image.
that's the whole concept of relative size, that the image on your retina represents, you have to know. So you could have a fire plug out in the distance, and if it's if it's at the end of the block, it makes a very small image on the retina, and if it's right next to you, it makes a very large image on the retina. And it's your knowledge of how big fire plugs should be that lets you know that tells you can't rely on that retinal image. So
Right.
yeah. And he does not have
And
that experience. There's no, that kind of comes back to the taxi example. Just it's the right shape of a taxi, but he's never had to do the comparison or the context analysis of that object in its space to know how far away it is.
And I think I want to add a little bit. We also get some depth perception information via motion as well, right? Whether something is moving towards us, away from us, or by us, remaining at the same distance. And the scene with him getting almost run over by a taxi was quintessential New Yorker thing. And so he got his New Yorker card for that. But he's also needing to analyze the motion information that he gets from the taxi moving toward him, right? So this image is getting bigger on his retina as it's moving toward him. Because he's standing still, but it's moving toward him, and he has to incorporate that information as well. And I kind of want to just like broadly say to chime in what we were talking about a little bit earlier with all of this information and object recognition and all of the brain areas and colloquial brain areas, as KatieAnn described them. This all comes down to a consciousness problem called the binding problem. And we don't have a really good answer for the binding problem, in that just the brain integrates all of this disparate information and we have conscious awareness of it. And I think this problem is one of the most fascinating problems in consciousness, and it definitely jives down into like philosophy areas.
Yeah, I'll let the philosophers handle that. I like decoding everything right up until the how is it we bring it, and I'd love to know how we bring it all together. As I've talked earlier, it's all these little bits of information that are being decoded by certain brain regions and sent out into their respective areas to where they're being represented. But how do we bring those together to create a conscious experience? And even when we remember things, we reactivate all of those disparate brain regions. It's not like it's a memory just in one little spot. You have the spot in the auditory cortex and the olfactory cortex and the parietal cortex that becomes activated, and how do we bring that together and create this conscious flow of experience? I don't know. And that had to be really overwhelming for someone who, it's kind of like for those of us that have our typical sensory systems, what would it be like if you suddenly had yet another one? What would it be like if all of a sudden you could, I'm trying to think of something fantastic. Yeah, I know that there's a guy out there who is he was colorblind, but he created a system that allows him to hear ultraviolet and hear all the colors. It transduces colors into sound.
Very cool.
And I think that would be really distracting. But yeah,
well, I mean, there are the super memorists out there that have these differently wired brains. Synesthesia is that, I guess, that extra sense that you're talking about, where we, not necessarily a new sense, but combined sensory experiences, which allow for better memory. There was the guy, and I'm blanking on his name, but there was a guy who couldn't forget a damn thing in his life. He had like superb eidetic memory for everything, and it was partly due to his synesthetic experience of combining senses of touch combined with sound, or colors combined with textures and these kinds of things. And I think, like you said, if it's not a gradual thing, then it becomes overwhelming. And I think that's the word of the day that we can put on Virgil's experience in this movie. He experiences an overwhelming sense of love for this new woman that he meets. And because he has this overwhelming sense of love and this connection to her, that he shares his blindness with her, in ways that is kind of implied that he doesn't with other people. And he has this overwhelming sense of love for her that he would go under this medical treatment that he didn't need, he couldn't afford, and didn't necessarily want at the very beginning. Like he scoffs at Amy, right? And then he has this overwhelming experience of sightedness that I don't think anyone really actually prepared him for.
Right.
And then he has this overwhelming sense of loss.
Yeah.
When he does start losing his vision again. And so overwhelming, I think, is a very accurate term for everything that Virgil experiences in this movie.
Yeah. Cool.
So I want to thank Dr. KatieAnn Skogsberg for joining me to discuss At First Sight. Before we say goodbye, KatieAnn, is there anything that you'd like to plug? I know you've been on sabbatical this semester. What have you been working on?
So, yeah, I was thinking about this. I do want to plug something for those that are teachers out there that are listening, whether you be college professors or AP Psych or anything like that. We have an ebook coming out through the Society of Teaching of Psychology on alternative grading methods. So if you've heard so even though I'm a sensation and perception person, I'm also really into teaching. And so this ebook has information from individual faculty that have taught courses in psychology and neuroscience using specifications grading, ungrading, and gamification. So a couple of different alternative teaching methods. And also we are looking to follow this one up with another ebook looking at data, experimental research on this. So if you're doing research on alternative grading methods, I'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. Thanks again for joining the show, KatieAnn.
Thanks for having me. I've had a good time. And thanks for introducing me to this film. I'm definitely going to use it in my classes in the future.
Awesome. That's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.